Hello again, my friends, and welcome back to Note to Self. My name is Melanie, and I am really looking forward to today's subject. I put a lot of thought and energy and effort into what I wanted to talk about today. The subject that I want to talk today has a lot of energy around it. Sometimes not such great energy. Sometimes people get offended. Sometimes people get hurt. So if you get a little triggered, just warning you right up front, this one's going to be a big one. So what I wanted to talk about is cults. What defines a cult? How do you know if you were raised in a cult? There's a lot of energy that comes around that word and a lot of judgment, a lot of stigma that comes around that word. And so I wanted to talk about that and how it shows up in my life, how it showed up in the lives of the people that I was raised with, and and just the judgments and stuff that come along with that word. So I was raised in what I always considered to be a cult. I was raised in a fundamentalist Mormon church, which is basically the easiest term to say is a polygamous cult. My parents were converted when they were very young, and they were converted, back in the 60s, 70s, where cults were really starting to become a thing. People really wanted to be a part of a community. They wanted to be a part of they wanted to feel that love. And, we just come out of some dark, heavy times in America, and people were just wanting to feel that love. And so cults became a pretty big thing back in the 60s, 70s type of, age. So there was quite a few of them. You see them all over. They're all over TV. They're all over social media. So you kind of see the definition of them. That word has actually become stigmatized to some degree at this point. And so there's a lot of hate that's spewed around that word. There's a lot of judgments that are spewed around that word. So I had a sister who decided to go public about a little over a year ago. And the platforms that she used defined the way that we were raised as cults, hate groups, white supremacists, all sorts of stuff like that, stuff that I felt like was blatantly untrue. So I decided to do some looking into it and diving into it. Now, I personally have always considered that I was raised in a cult. The way that I was raised fits the Webster's Dictionary definition of a cult. So after my sister decided to go public, the moderator that she went with, I was disgusted by the way that she brought out, my sister's story. So I decided to make a public statement about it, as public as I guess as you could get, where it's just my social media. But it ended up getting a few thousand views. And so I basically talked about, there was no question we were raised in a cult. We were absolutely, but the other stuff that this moderator has said were blatant lies. And so I feel like I wanted to talk about that, about how we define a group of people, and because they don't agree with us or the same way as us, it's okay to hate them. It's okay to spew hate on them because they're different. They don't agree with us. What they're doing is wrong. What they're doing is bad. What they're doing is, out of the public norm. So it's okay to spew that hate. So I kind of want to take a look at both sides of this today, and see about are people who society stigmatizes as being in cults, are they oppressed? Are they treated with hate and anger and called names that aren't necessarily true? White supremacists, that kind of stuff. So right after I did this public announcement, I received a phone call, and it was a very stern phone call, and it was very much, you will not use this word on social media ever again. There was no, hey, let me talk to you about this. Why do you feel like you need to use this word? It was, you will not do this. Well, I'm 49 years old. I don't really need to be told that I can or cannot use certain words on social media. But it actually got me thinking and really got me looking into how do we, what are the words that we use? Can they be hate? Do they turn into hate? And a lot of times you're seeing the bandwagon right now of a lot of people, that's hate speech. That's whatever. Well, let's look into it. Let's look into the definition of a cult and whether we should or should not use that word anymore. For those that are being accused of being in a cult, it can be really offensive. It can be really hurtful. It can, and I still have a lot of family that are in the society that I grew up in, and which I personally would consider a cult based on all definitions. It is. And we'll go through those definitions during this podcast. I'll go through them and I'll give you some real life experiences that I experienced growing up. And then those on the other side can use these words as actual hate speech to inflict harm and hate and anger onto a group of people. Now, a lot of times when someone is put into a society or a group of people, such as a cult, it dehumanizes them. When I received that phone call that I will not be using that word online anymore, I actually received quite a few articles of why we should not use that word. What does it do? It dehumanizes a population. So I can kind of see both sides of that. I understand why it can be used as a weapon against people. It dehumanizes them, makes them so that it's easier for hate and anger to be spewed upon them because they don't matter. They're in a cult. So there's a lot of different feelings and emotions towards that. So, but on the flip side of it, I'll use the words that I choose to use. And I was definitely, in my definition and based on the research that I have done, was raised in a cult. So let's go over that. So one of the main characteristics of a cult, I'm going to go through a list and I'm going to talk about some of my experiences. First we're going to go through the Merriam-Webster's definition of a cult. A cult is a religion regarded as unorthodox or spurious. Also, a body of adherents. You can have a voodoo cult, a satanic cult. You can have, cults cult followings of certain celebrities, which we see that all over right now, especially right now. There's one celebrity in particular that is so big and she would be considered to have a cult following. The second definition is a great devotion to a person, an idea, object, movement, or work, such as a film or a book. Another one is a system of religious beliefs in ritual, and a formal religious worship, a system for the cure of disease based on dogma set forth by its promulgator. So you can have health cults, you can have, all sorts of, there's a whole bunch of different types of cults that we could define. Most of them are considered, religious. You're going to have self-help cults. I mean, that one we see a lot. People will go into a society and it becomes very cultish in the way that nothing else matters. It only matters what they hear and learn in this society. Another one that we're seeing pop up a lot lately, I'm seeing pop up, is political. You're seeing a lot of people say, oh, you belong to this cult or you belong to that cult. We're seeing our government officials use the word cult quite often now, and they're using it in a negative connotation. So when you go to the actual definition of a cult, does it fit? Does it not fit? And why are our government leaders using it in negativity? So because the articles that I sent, I agree with that in the fact that they dehumanize a population and it makes it easier to hate on that population because their opinions don't matter as much because they are, quote, in a cult. So I pulled up a list of characteristics of a cult. One of the main characteristics of a cult, I'm going to read these, is a charismatic leader. Cults always follow a charismatic leader, a living one or a dead one, whose teachings are considered of the highest importance. This leader may be considered a genius or may be considered a religious figure, like a messiah or a prophet. So the religion that I was raised in, we definitely had different types of figures like this that we would consider to be, we would put up in that higher, where we worshiped them. I was raised in an offshoot of the LDS Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and the main prophet of that church was Joseph Smith. So a lot of people can say that the LDS Church was a cult because a lot of people would follow this one particular leader. He was very charismatic. People loved him. The teachings that he taught were of love. I'm just going to go over basic teachings. They were of love. They were of, eternal life, eternal companionship with your family, all sorts of stuff like that. So it brought about a huge following, obviously. Well, as part of the laws and part of the, teachings that he taught, started to diminish down. Well, they started to change some of the way that they believed, started to change some of the theories and philosophies. So one of the biggest ones was plural marriage, polygamy. And a lot of people felt like that was the one be all to end all in the religion. So that was the one that they needed to follow the most. So there's a bunch of different offshoots. Whole bunch, you're going to see your, leaders that are in prison now. You're going to see a bunch. Well, the leadership that I grew up in and was born and raised into was the prophet was Rulon Allred. So I know more people than not that have a testimony or what they believe to be a confirmation from whatever God they believe in, that Rulon Allred was a prophet of God. And so they have more faith and confidence in him as a man than they did in the actual church itself. And I've had that experience. I've had that told to me numerous times. Well, he was just such a charismatic leader. He spoke of God. He never just blurted things out. They have all these reasons why he was such a wonderful man and prophet. And so more people believed in him as a person, in my personal experience, than they did in the actual religion itself. They believed in what he told them to do, what he experienced them to do. Now, I don't remember him personally. I was really quite young when he was killed. So he was killed by another rival cult or another rival polygamous group. And so I don't really remember him. He was the doctor at my birth. And so I do have a lot of interaction with him, but I was only about 4, maybe 5 years old when he was killed. So, but a lot of people have put a lot of faith and trust in him as a person more than they did in the actual religion itself. So because he was so charismatic and so liked and kind, and people really, really gravitated towards him. And like I said, back in the 60s and 70s, I obviously wasn't alive for some of that, but it feels like if you go back and look at societal norm, there's a lot of cults. People wanted to belong. They wanted to have that sense of belonging. And so they believed and attached themselves to groups that they felt that sense of belonging, that sense of, love and kindness and friendship and community. And so community was a big thing. So now number 2, ideological purity. Members are strongly discouraged from questioning the cult's doctrine, and any doubts are met with shame and punishment. Boy, this was a big one for me, because if you did not have a testimony, let's say, of plural marriage, you didn't always have to pray about all the other, you're supposed to, but the biggest one was testimony of plural marriage. And if you questioned that at all, then you were considered unfaithful, or you were considered, maybe you weren't one of the strong ones. Maybe you weren't meant for the 144,000 that God was saving on this earth to protect, bring in the last days of Christ. So there's a lot of shame and guilt. I remember questioning it a lot because I watched my mother, I watched my parents grow up, and it looked miserable. It did not look like a good way to live. And also, I was married 8 days into 17. When my husband at the time wanted to start dating another wife, she was 16 and I was 17. I would have been 18 at the time. So I was 18 and she was 16 and he was 25. You bet I had a lot of questions about that. And I didn't know if all that, of course I went along with it because this is what I was told. This is how I was raised. This is what I needed to do. And so I did follow along with a lot of what was said and done because I felt that I didn't have any other choice. Well, now it was coming home to me personally. Now I actually had to share a husband. I had to share, and so now is when I needed to know these things for myself. And the minute that I asked any questions, there was so much shame and guilt. Like, you should have prayed about this before you were married in the first place. You should have known this, and so then there's not a lot of room. I didn't feel I had a lot of room to question and say, wait a minute, am I doing the right thing? Wait a minute, does this work for me? Wait a minute, and so I didn't have that freedom. And so I felt extremely pressured into doing the things that I was instructed to do. And the shame and the guilt, shame and guilt are two of the lowest vibrations this planet offers. And when most religions are based in shame and guilt, my personal opinion. And so when you have that low of a vibration, there's no room for exploration of truths, because it's one way, or you got it wrong. You're not meant for the highest kingdom of God. So I didn't feel like I really had a lot of options to question it. I did eventually end up saying, no, I'm not going to do this. I ended up pregnant with my second child, and I didn't want to go through that whole process, being pregnant and being so young. By the time he dated this girl I was 18, she was 16. And then I found out I was pregnant about a couple months into the courtship, and ended the courtship. So I didn't, and we just kind of never picked it up again after that. He wanted to, I didn't want to. So we ended up ending that. But the shame and the guilt, I could go on that one forever. So the third one, conformity and control. Cult leaders often exercise an extreme degree of control over the members' lives, including dictating what they can wear, what they can eat, and what kind of relationships they can have. Conformity is also enforced by a group of members who police one another. Oh boy, this is like a whole subject and topic in and of itself, because the policing that went on, they call it policing, but let's just be real, it's gossip. People loved to watch out after other people. Are you doing what I think you should be doing? I lived a huge majority of my life doing what other people thought I should be doing, living the way other people thought that I should be living. And they were not shy to tell me that I was not conforming to the way that they wanted me to live. One of the biggest examples during this, I was a young girl in my, 14, 15 years old. And one of the biggest examples, this is kind of a heavy example, but it really pulls into the conformity part of it, and then goes right back into the ideological purity, and that you have to I had to conform to other people's beliefs. So I was 14, 15, had this boy that I was deeply in love with at the time, as deep as love as you think you can get when you're 14 or 15, right? And thought, I'm marrying this boy, I'm doing all of these things. Well, my parents didn't like that, and we weren't, there was a lot of things that happened during that relationship. We were getting too serious, too fast. I was sneaking out of the house. I was starting to do things that my parents were not approving of at all. And they were worried. They were worried that they were going to lose me as a righteous soul. And so there was a lot of shame and a lot of guilt on that. Well, one night we're driving home from church, and it's just my parents and me in the car. And I like to refer to this example as it felt like I had an exorcism performed on me that night, because we were diverted and went to his parents' house. We went to his parents' home, and it felt like an eternity, but it was probably realistically an hour, maybe two, where I was just browbeaten. I was shamed and guilted, and the tears were flowing. I was hysterically crying. It was this, what are you doing? We need to know every single detail of everything that you've ever done with this boy physically. Where have you guys gone? How much sexual activity have you done? It was horrible. It was one of the worst experiences of my life. And here I am, this 15-year-old girl about to turn 16. I might have even been 16. It was right around that time frame. And I was being just torn apart by these, and just the embarrassment, the sheer embarrassment that I felt, because here I had my parents and then I had his parents. And a question was asked to me, don't you just feel dirty? Don't you feel like you want to shower all the time and you never get the dirt off of you? doesn't your body feel disgusting and gross? And I'm like, oh, shoot, I think it does, And so just that shame and that guilt and just the conformity. Well, after that whole meeting, of course, I'm hysterical. I'm crying. I'm devastated. It literally felt like they were pulling demons out of my body, or they thought they were at least pulling all these evil spirits that would cause me to do all of these things that they didn't agree with. And I was immediately rushed back out to a baptismal font and rebaptized the same night. And the reason why is because if I'm rebaptized and I'm clean and pure again, I won't make those same mistakes again. Because if I do, boy, that punishment's going to be a lot harder than the original punishment, right? And so that for me was such an ultimate level of power and control that people wanted to put over me. It's like, I wasn't going to listen to you and do the things that you wanted me to do. So now you're going to exercise the full strength and power of every tool that you had to make me conform and make me do the things that they felt like I needed to do. That was quite an experience for me. I was devastated. And I lived with the shame and guilt of that for years. And of course, it whipped me right into conforming. Of course, my ex-husband at the time, he was considered to be a worthy man to date. So, of course, I put the boyfriend aside that I was with and went with the worthy man to date because he was parent approved. He was prophet approved. The prophet loved him at the time. And so, of course, and this other boy that I was involved in, my parents did not approve. The prophet did not approve. He was shunned and ran out of the polygamous community that we grew up in. He was ran off. And so he was not worthy of me or good enough for me. But this other guy was, right? So, and there's a whole, I'll get into a podcast about that too, because that was quite the, as long as you mislead, lie, or direct, nobody knows what your actions are, you're a good person. So, all right. So now number 4. So that one was, I'll just wrap that one up. That one was really a big one for me. That directed my life for quite a while because for quite a few years, I lived in so much shame and guilt, and I hung my head down and became humble and did the things that I was told to do because I literally had these evil spirits pulled out of my body and then I was rebaptized. And so there was no question that I was going to be doing what I was told from that point forward. The next one, mind-altering practices, sleep deprivation, chanting, meditation, and drugs are often used to break down an individual's defense and make them more susceptible to occult ideology. So the group that I grew up in, I wouldn't say that there was necessarily drugs involved, not that I was ever participated in or aware of. Sleep deprivation, I'm not a morning person, but a lot of times the early morning prayer circles that they would do were extremely early. I felt sleep deprived going to them, especially as a young mother having an infant throughout the nighttime and then having to get up at 5 a.m. to go chant prayers in a prayer temple. So there was a lot of chanting that happened. There was a lot of, and I won't get too deeply into any of the endowment house or temple. We had what was our own temple that was very similar to the LDS church's temple. The ceremonies were very similar, and the the things that you would do in the temple ceremonies were very similar. So there was a lot of that type of chanting in the prayers, and that was my first experience of that. I literally looked around the room like, what is happening? Is this real? Like, because I had seen these types of, things, these scenarios depicted on television or depicted on movies, I didn't think they really existed. And here I was in the middle of one in a full ceremonial dress, full ceremonial headgear, full ceremonial, and I wasn't sure because I had no idea when I first got married. I mean, gosh, I was 8 days into 17. I had no clue what I was going into. No idea. And a lot of people say that, especially in the LDS church, if you are, if you follow anybody who has, ex-Mormon, ex-whatever, they'll tell you they were not prepared for the temple ceremony. I was not prepared for the temple ceremony. I had no idea what was about to happen to me. And being so young, and only a year and a half before that, I had, this exorcism, what I refer to as an exorcism, performed. I didn't question it. I just went with it. But as I was in there, because I was following the rules and doing what I was told, it was really, it was tricky for me, because I looked around like, these people aren't serious, are they? But I didn't want to be disrespectful of the process either. I really tried to be respectful of what I believed were covenants I was making between myself and God, between my parents that were there, between the priesthood holder, the prophets, all of the people that were there. I felt maybe I was the odd one. I was the one who missed the notes somewhere. I'm the one who missed because everyone else just was going with it like it wasn't different. And it felt different to me. It felt weird. It didn't feel natural. Some of the chantings and some of the prayers that were said didn't feel natural to me. Now, that being said, I'm not trying to judge those who do take those processes and believe in them and are serious about them. I'm not trying to be disrespectful to that at all. But for me personally, it didn't sit right. It felt very unnatural for me. So I wouldn't say that there was a lot of, like I said, no drugs involved, but back in the 70s and stuff, when a lot of these groups were forming, drugs were a huge part of that. They just weren't personally part of my experience. So, in going through this, I want to go through the experiences that I have had. All right. So the next one is isolation and love bombing. It's common for people in cults to be encouraged to cut contact with outsiders, including close family members. Within the cult, new members are often subjected to love bombing, and a practice where new initiates are showered with love and praised to bring them deeper into the cult and foster them with a sense of belonging. This kind of goes back to what I was saying before. People wanted to belong. They wanted to be in a sense of community. They wanted to feel like they're in something that everyone had a commonality and a common good and a common goal. So the isolation and love bombing, oh my gosh, so many experiences as I watched this, because I was born into it. I didn't personally experience having necessarily some of the love bombing. Of course I did when I got engaged and I was about to go through the temple or the endowment house. I experienced some of that love bombing, like, oh, you made the best choice. You made the right choice. People were constantly reassuring me and reaffirming to me that I was doing the right thing. But I did watch other people experience this, and I did personally experience this. People who joined the group after I was already, born and raised into, I watched them come in, and I watched them. Everybody wanted to love on them, and everybody, come on in, especially those who had money. Money was kind of really defined your status to some degree. Now my mom personally, she was isolated from her family for a little bit after she joined the group. After she married my dad as a second wife, she was isolated from her family. My husband's mother was isolated from her family as well. Her mother didn't even know where she was for I don't know the time frame, but a long time. Her mother had no idea where she was because she was isolated from her family. And I feel like a lot of the reason why they do this is because, they don't want people, you don't want people coming in and putting seeds of doubt into this new convert's mind. And especially when they're brand new. Where I was born and raised into it, they didn't want seeds of doubt being planted into my brain about, should you go through the temple? Should you go through the endowment house? Should you participate in these kind of, ordinances and, what's the word that I'm looking for? I can't even think of the word. It went right out of my brain, but they really want you to stay away from that kind of energy. One of the things, I didn't have friends outside of church. I went to a regular high school, went to a regular elementary school, but I didn't have friends. I didn't do anything outside of that school situation. All of my friends were part of the church group that I grew up in. Um, any extracurricular activities I did with my friends in the church group, or they were youth activities or church activities that were church sponsored. I went to one dance in high school, in junior high. That was it. And I was the awkward kid that I didn't even know how to act in public. And it's interesting because now that I've been out of it for so long and I see new people come out of the religion and try to incorporate into I don't know, the world, I guess, I see the same uncomfortableness. I was socially awkward, socially uncomfortable. I didn't even know how to hold conversations with people because I just didn't have any friends outside of that religious community. I didn't even know what I didn't read. I wasn't really allowed to read or didn't read magazines. We did watch television, but not a lot of television. So the isolation was very much there for me. It was, even though we were raised in a suburb, we were raised in a regular neighborhood, we were raised, we were able to have friends if we wanted to. I had siblings who had a lot of friends. I just didn't personally. And I think being the oldest, there was a little bit more of an expectation for me than there was some of my siblings. And so I really tried to conform to that, and tried to do what my parents wanted me to do, with the exception of this one boyfriend that I had. That I didn't always follow the rules the way that I was supposed to follow the rules on that one. So the isolation is very true. People will disappear for a period of time. Typically, they'll come back to their families eventually, but they will disappear for a period of time, and they feel like it's in their best interest to do so, so that they can establish what they consider to be their testimony or their knowledge of whether this is right for them or not for them. And I feel like I did that too when I was, trying to search if whether I should get married this way or not. I feel like I kind of disappeared for a little while to really kind of pray about it, get my feelings in alignment with what they were supposed to be. And so I don't, that the isolation is a big one because there's so many ways that can be interpreted, but you really are, I always prided myself in, I didn't grow up in one of those really extreme communities, but as I go back and I look at some of the stories that I had, yeah, I actually they were just a little bit different. Some of the isolations were just a little bit different. And I remember my grandmother telling me all the time growing up, how sad she was when my mom left, that she was devastated. And maybe she had her own agenda in some of the words that she chose to use with me, in guilting me. But she was so worried that she would never have a relationship with my mom or me. I was her first granddaughter, and she was worried she'd never have a relationship with me. And she'd tell me that frequently, tell me those stories growing up, that she was so concerned that because my mom just disappeared for a while. And then of course my grandparents, I believe to some degree wrote her off, but, so it can go both directions. But isolation and love bombing, those are two really, really big ones that happen. And it really is, it's just that it's creating that foundational belief of belonging and community, and outside influences can get in the way of that. So isolation is necessary. Okay, the next one, us versus them mentality. Cult members are often encouraged to see the cult as superior to life on the outside and to feel that those on the outside of the cult lack the understanding and insight. I was taught this my entire life. From basically coming out of the womb, I was taught that we were God's chosen people, that we were the chosen one, that we were part of the 144,000 that were the righteous followers that were going to bring in the second coming of Christ. We were the ones out of all of the billions of people on the planet. Look how lucky I was to be born and raised in this society. And so truthfully, it wasn't necessarily that I didn't have friends outside of the church. It was that I didn't want to have friends outside of the church. Why would I? Why would I want to have anything to do with people who had less than and had and didn't have as much knowledge as I did. Why would I want to have anything to do with them? They couldn't provide me anything. And so to some degree, there was a level of superiority. Even though I didn't see it as superiority at the time, I felt like I was just odd. I felt like I was, I didn't fit in. But at the same time, there was also that other thinking that went into, no, I am part of a bigger picture. I am the chosen one. I can't believe how lucky you don't know how many times I thought that in my life, how lucky I was to be born into a society that God chose me specifically to be in this, to be one of these promised chosen people. And I used to say to my mom, what about all the other people? What about all the people on the other side of the world that didn't have a chance? Well, when they die, then they'll have a chance to hear the gospel and accept it or not accept it. But here on the earth side, only a certain few of us are going to have that opportunity. And I was one of those lucky ones that was born and raised into that. Now, that right there is such a separation. I mean, the separation energy that is taught in just some of the way things are said. I believe it's still taught pretty strongly. And it's also taught in most religions. It doesn't matter who you are. It's taught in politics. Look at it. Look at our country right now. It's us versus them mentality. I feel like when we, use us versus them mentality, it's one of the lowest vibrations that we have on this planet, because it pits you against another human, another soul that you could otherwise have collaboration with, that you could otherwise learn from, that you could otherwise have, you could learn and grow and create with these people. But when you have separation, all of that goes away. You don't have that ability to collaborate. You don't have that ability to create with other people that have maybe learned something different than you, learned something, more than you. So us versus them mentality was, man, that's a hard one. And when I left the polygamous group, I experienced that so severely, because no one, like I said in some of my previous podcasts, no one in my family had left before. I was the first one. I was the first one to go all the way through getting married into the temple and receiving, my ordinances and receiving what, you'd wear special clothing. And I was the first one in my family to go through all of that and then turn around and leave a couple of years later. And the us versus them mentality was horrible. The way people treated me was unbelievable. The tears that I shed all the time, these people that I considered to be my friends for my entire life now wrote me off and would no longer speak to me, would no longer have anything to do with me. My grandmother was probably one of the worst ones. The way that she treated me when I left, she was so ashamed and so embarrassed of me. How could I do this to her? How could I do this to our family? Like, we were considered to be, this ideal family. People really looked up to our family, really looked up to my parents, really looked up to my dad. And now here I am leaving. And I really experienced the us versus them mentality at that point. Before, I was on the us part of it, and now I was on the them part of it. And it made me question a lot. It made me question whether I was doing the right thing, whether I was, whether I was, maybe I didn't quite know and I needed to pray harder and I needed to, because obviously I wasn't one of the 144,000. And that was really hard for me to grasp, because I was put on such a high expectation to live a certain way and be a certain type of, good follower and a good polygamous wife and a good polygamous, daughter. And so that was, I can't even find all the words to adequately express how hard that was to go from the us part of that to the them part of that. And what was interesting about that too is, at one point I ended up having a baby that was sick, and they thought he was, had a hole in his heart, thought he was going to die. And my first thought was, Oh my, and this is after I had left the polygamous group for about 3 years or 2 years. I think I was gone for 2 years at that point. And my first thought when I found this out was God was punishing me because I left and I needed to run back. And so I ran back wholeheartedly, went back in there and did everything I was supposed to do to try to save my baby, and my marriage was in jeopardy at the time. And so I ran back in there to try to do these things to save, because there was such this, I've stepped out of the superiority of the religion and all of that. And so God's now punishing me. So that was really, when it's interesting the way that I was treated. I for a short amount of time, stepped back into the us part of things, and people welcomed me with open arms, but I was still less than because I questioned and left in the first place. And so I would still never obtain what I had up here because I had stepped down and I no longer belonged up here. I could still come back and still join, but I was lower. I was less than because I questioned and left in the first place. So that one was a tough one for me to experience that personally. When I finally did leave, it's interesting because I see quite a few families that are now have television shows, and some of them were the worst judgers of me when I left. I experienced some of the worst interactions with some of those people. So it was really hard for me to sit back and watch some of the TV programs that they've done and listened to some of the way that they have, talked about their experiences leaving, because part of me felt like, where's the grace and the compassion? I didn't experience any of that when I left. And now they are going through their crisis of faith and questioning where they are and deconstructing what they believed. And they would like the compassion and grace too, but they didn't always dish that out. And when you go through, a crisis of faith and you deconstruct what you have been programmed and taught your entire life, man, that is quite the experience, and is something that follows me for the rest of my life. It's something that I consistently look into all the time. Whenever I notice a pattern in myself, I'll take a step back and look, and is this part of deconstructing some of the beliefs that were programmed into me as a child? Because these were absolutely, in my opinion, programs. Okay, the next one, apocalyptic thinking. Preparing for a supposed apocalypse or cataclysmic event is a major characteristic of many cults, especially cult religions. Of course, we were taught that. There was a part of the group that I grew up in, there was a whole division, I guess, if you want to call that, of men and boys that they took to Montana and created an entire society in Montana. One of the prophets had, prophesied at some point that the boys will go to the mountains in the last days. So they created a society in the mountains so that we would have a refuge, a safe place. The apocalyptic thinking, this is one that I've really had a hard time working through in my whole entire life, because I really didn't want to be that doomsdayer. But it's so hard. This is probably one of the hardest deconstructions I've had to work through, because some of it's just genuine preparedness. And I have a hard time sometimes depicting, am I being prepared, or am I having apocalyptic thinking? Which one is this? And that's been a struggle for me. I won't even pretend that it hasn't been, because there's a difference between being prepared in an emergency and thinking that the world is going to end any day. And I literally was taught that the world was going to end any day Christ was coming back, any day we needed to be fully prepared with food storage. And the thing is that so much of the apocalyptic thinking is rational thinking. It's just when it gets taken to an extreme that becomes irrational. And then you're raising your children through fear and not preparation. And there's a difference. There's a huge difference to say, be prepared spiritually, mentally, physically, with all of the things that you need to have to survive if something were to happen. That's a whole lot different than saying, you better be prepared or God's going to wipe you from this planet when Christ comes again. Totally different experience. And I was definitely raised with that fear that just, life is going to end. And I remember, I was telling this to my mother not too long ago. I remember the day that we had left Sunday school. We had two different types of churches. So we had Sunday school in the morning where the families would come. And then we had what was called a church service or whatever after in the afternoon, where the parents would go, or the adults and the youth. And that would be like where you would take the sacrament and some of the ordinances of the LDS church that are practiced in the polygamous church as well. Those were performed there. And I remember being at a Sunday school, and my grandpa, I called him my grandpa, gave a fire and hell and brimstone speech in Sunday school. And I remember sitting there being terrified. I was probably 5, maybe. And I remember just sitting there as a little girl, looking up at him, being completely terrified. And I remember thinking, why would you want to scare people like that? Why would you want, to terrify little children? And I walked outside of his home, because we had it at his home out here in Utah. And I walked outside of the home, and I remember standing underneath one of the apricot trees thinking to myself, I am going to raise my children to do things because for a love of whatever it is. They're going to do things because they want the love or the reward, not because they're afraid of what's going to happen. I want them to follow a Christ or follow a God or not, because they believe that and they're doing it because of the love that they'll receive, not because they're afraid he's going to come down from heaven with fear, fire and brimstone and kill them. And that where I feel like is very much the apocalyptic thinking is it is such a fear-based thinking that there literally is, it's such a low vibration. You can't vibrate at a higher frequency when you are constantly living in fear. And so that I remember very distinctly that I was going to absolutely raise my children to do things because of the reward of what they're going to get, not because of the fear. Let's see, the last one, time and energy. Followers are expected to dedicate a huge amount of time and energy, often money. That was a huge one, yes, to the cult and to the exclusion of their own lives, interests, jobs, and families. Boy, each one of these we could go off on a whole podcast about them, but this one was so true. It was a constant coming to classes. You always had all the extra activities. You always had all of the youth activities and all of the church activities and your callings, and your whole life is consumed in when's the next responsibility coming up? When do I need to show up again to perform my responsibilities or duties to help keep this community thriving and this community going on? And obviously money and resources are huge for that. And how many times if you grew up the way in the LDS church or even in a polygamous church, I was told dozens of times in my lifetime, if you need to choose between feeding your family or paying your tithing, you pay your tithing and the Lord will provide a way for you to feed your family. And I was told that over and over and over again. And so I saw people give every penny that they had to the church, everything, only to see the church squander that money away, only to see the church, certain people lived very comfortably, had very comfortable lifestyles, while some of the other people had nothing, and in the particular church I grew up in, there was, a whole scandal of some financial resources that were stolen, and there was millions of dollars involved. Well, they ended up going back to the members of the church and said, we have to pay this money back. We need $2,000 or $3,000 from each one of you. Well, these families that couldn't even provide for their own basic necessities were now taking on 2 or 3 jobs to go back and earn the money to help take care of this responsibility that the court system found the group that I grew up in liable for. And so I've watched this gross unfairness of people that live on the backs and resources of other people. And I've experienced that and watched that my entire life. Even within my own family, there was a wife who was a higher than the other wife. My mom was the workhorse. She gave and gave and gave and gave of her time, her energy, her resources over and over and over to women in this family who didn't give it back. Who they didn't, they took, and they kept taking and they kept taking and they kept taking. And I watched my mom. So I watched it from a micro level of just my intimate family, my immediate family, to an entire society. I watched this happen. And that is one of the things that does happen when you are in a cult society. There is a hierarchy, and there are people who happen to gain more than others. My mom owned a health food store when I was growing up, and she gave of those resources hundreds, if not thousands of dollars to her sister wives, to her family, only to be told in her later years that she's not even, qualified to own a home at this point, because all of her resources that she gave of time, money, everything went into the family. Well, now she is no longer a part of the family, and she's not entitled to any of those resources. And it's disgusting. It's disgusting to watch. And so I see it on an intimate micro level of my own family. And then I see it on a group level. You give your entire life to these. You give resources, finances, interest, time, everything. And then if you ever question or you ever doubt and you want to take a step out, you've lost all of that. Your entire life is now gone. Everything that you've worked towards. I've watched people give thousands and thousands of dollars and then walk away with nothing. I've watched my own husband's father give thousands and thousands of dollars only to be kicked out and left and in his dying days, after he has given thousands and thousands of dollars in resources. I myself, gave thousands and thousands of dollars in tithing. Now, not to say that it's all used for, questionable circumstances. That's not it. But it does happen. It does happen in any organization. There is a hierarchy of needs, and people will have their needs met, and other people are the workhorses. Other people are the help. And then other people are the beneficiaries of that help. And so I did experience that so much. And I think if that one's a little bit more tender for me, because I grew up as the help, not necessarily one of the beneficiaries. And I watched some of my siblings and some of my other mothers benefit from the hard work of me, my mom, the endless hours of babysitting that we would do. And so because I wasn't on that hierarchy of, here, let me benefit from, your hard work, I was experiencing it from the other end of it. And so that one was a really, really hard one for me, because I've obviously got some unresolved emotional attachment about that. So these are kind of some of the different things. So when we look at a cult in overall, one of the biggest things I think about, the definition of a cult, one of the biggest things I feel like is so fear-based, because especially in the cult that I grew up in, I'm going to refer to it as a cult because it was, by all definition, it was a cult. It is a cult. So one of the biggest fears that I was taught growing up is, you do this or else you will lose your family. You will lose your standing with God. You will not have eternal life. You will not have an eternal family. You will not have all of these things. So you do these things or else. And there was a constant fear of losing your family, constant fear of losing your children, constant fear of losing your parents, constant fear of losing a relationship with God. And that was basically the foundational part of that. So now in society today, cult is, I agree with the other side of it, that it is used to dehumanize people. So how many, how do we take these words that are true definitions, that are true, they define what it is you're trying to explain, but how do we take that hate out of it? And so for me, it does explain. I was raised in a cult. I was raised in an extreme religious community. And my first couple of podcasts, I tried not to use the word cult because I was trying to be respectful. I was trying to be respectful of, the phone call that I received that said, you will not use this word. There was no, hey, please don't use this word, or hey, let's talk about this. Why do you feel like you need to use this word? There was no exploration as to why I felt that that word was necessary. It was just, once again, because this is a theme in my life, I was told that I would not be using that word anymore. And so that's why I really wanted to explore this and kind of go through the different, the different ways that these words are used. There's so many words in our society now that are taboo words. We don't allow them anymore because they are considered hate speech. They are considered, you spewing hate onto someone else. And so we are losing a lot of our freedoms of speech, a lot of our freedoms to be able to say the things that we want to, and how do we say them. When we use a word, we cannot decide or determine how that word is received by the person that's hearing these words. We cannot determine that. All we can determine is how we use the words. How do we express ourselves? Are we using this word with the anger, with the hate, with the intention of separation? Are we using these words with the intention of hurt? And so that's really where I feel like so much of our society has gone sideways, is the fact that we cannot be held accountable or liable for the way someone else receives what we have said. Someone can say something to me in anger and hate and vileness, and I can receive it as, oh my gosh, thank you for that feedback. I hadn't looked at it like that. And I can choose how I want to receive that communication. Now, same goes the other way. I can use the word cult. I can use the word, so many different words I'll choose not to use right now, but I can use that in vileness, anger, and hate. And the person on the other side can choose how to receive that. Accountability is a huge, huge thing that I feel like I have learned through the whole process of deconstructing my faith and deconstructing my belief in what I consider to be a cult. It literally is like deconstructing your entire physical being, your entire physical structure, your DNA, everything. It's like deconstructing all of that. And accountability is huge when you're wanting to rebuild a foundation. Because when I was programmed at such a young age, because it is programming, in my personal opinion, it is programming. I was programmed to believe and behave a certain way. And when I get older, you're seeing the rebellion in society today of just people just want to be who they want to be. And they don't want you to dictate them. They don't want me to dictate who they are and how they have to behave. It's the same kind of thing when you're deconstructing your faith and you're deconstructing your religion. It's like breaking your cells, breaking your physical form down to a molecular level, and then rebuilding that to, wait a minute, how do I want to behave? How do I want to believe? How do I want to, experience world? What kind of energy do I want to have? And where do I want to vibrate at, so that I am operating on a frequency of healing and love and compassion? So I feel like personally, accountability is a huge part of that deconstruction, because I want to be accountable for building myself back up, building myself. If I'm going to build a person, if I'm going to deconstruct an entire faith and I'm going to build that person back up, you bet I want to be accountable for who that person turns out to be, who I turn out to be, how I turn out to be. Am I going to be, because if I'm going to do that and I'm going to go through all of that hell and all of that pain of recreating myself, why wouldn't I want to do the best version of myself possible? Why wouldn't I want to be accountable for every single step that I make? So cults, big word, a lot of energy, I've got a lot of energy still about it. I will be using that word in my podcasts from here on out, because it is a word that accurately describes how I was raised and what formation I was raised in. So unfortunately, it does have a negative connotation, and it is only getting worse because, especially right now in our political scene where people are being called cult members of this group or cult members of that group, it's up to us as individuals in our society to make a change and be accountable for the way we receive information and be accountable for the way we portray information. And so, yes, it's a big word. There's a lot of energy around it. Hopefully you found some of this podcast helpful, because I've really put a lot of thought and time into this. And there's so much more that I could go into. I feel like I start talking and then I'm like, oh, I could go here. Oh, I could go there. There's so many more avenues to travel down, especially when you're talking about this kind of information. There's a lot of energy there. So thank you so much. This one went a lot longer than my previous podcast, but I really feel like the information is relevant, especially in our society today. The information is extremely relevant. We are, and hopefully you find some good tidbits out of this podcast. And thank you again. And hopefully you'll join me for my next couple of podcasts. I hope you have a great day. Thank you so much.